Alright, we are going to show off this character's damage against Designated Punching Bag, the Oathbreaker Knight. Notice that we have no pre-buffs except ones that last all day, no elixirs, and no buffs from an ally. We're not even fully geared with a bunch of empty gear slots, and yet we're still going to take this guy almost from full to zero. We begin with making an Ensnaring Strike, which costs both our action and bonus action, but we're going to get those both back when we start combat.
Picks a fight.
We don't use sneak attack since we didn't get a critical hit, which is somewhat unlikely. We have a very high chance of getting a critical hit. But since we are now against an enemy who is surprised, we are guaranteed critical hits. We're going to begin by activating Brace, which allows us to reroll our range damage. Of course, we're doing only range damage. And then we are going to fire off a Hamstring Shot. Since we missed on our Ensnaring Strike, it didn't ensnare him, we might as well get this Hamstring Shot to slow him down in case he survives our initial barrage. Guaranteed critical hit, so we are going to land our sneak attack, making so that we get our additional sneak attack damage. Then we get to fire off a Dread Ambusher attack, which is also a guaranteed critical hit, multiplying the Dread Ambusher damage, and then yet another ranged attack. Yet another guaranteed critical hit, putting our enemy down to 122 hit points. And then finally, our last attack. Of course, if we had haste from an ally, speed potions, or anything like that, we could continue to make these attacks. But we're just going to attack for just a cool 210 damage just to start things off with our opponent surprised and hamstrung, so we get at least one more round of these attacks against him. This will guarantee killing the Oathbreaker Knight before he gets to act. Obviously our party members would do it for us if I let this fight play out, but you will be averaging something like 200 to 250 damage in your opening round of combat, plus an additional 150 every round of combat thereafter. Alright, let's get to the build. Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 build guide. I hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering my pick for the best sustained damage archer in Baldur's Gate 3. Where a lot of my previous archer builds have focused on getting the highest initial burst damage possible to take one enemy out, this build keeps a lot of that damage, but adds in additional sustained damage throughout the rest of the fight, so that if a fight goes long, you have more options for continuing to do damage and continuing to win combats, even if you happen to not be able to kill all the enemies immediately. The way that we do that is by adding a bunch of extra damage dice to all of our attacks, which also combos extremely well with the very high critical hit chance and guaranteed critical hits that this build will get to give us a ton of additional damage. We'll probably average somewhere in the mid-hundreds, like 150 or so damage per round, with initial burst damage in the high 200s, depending on exactly what pre-buffs and stuff we set up with. That's an incredible amount of damage, obviously, that is going to take most enemies out of the fight immediately, and you'll have just seen that by the time we get into this build, as well as giving you additional options when you have to whittle down an extremely high health boss or longer encounters throughout the game. I'm using Astarion as the example character for this build because I usually like to use him for archer builds, but also I think this one is extremely thematic for him because the additional necrotic damage that we will be getting, you can flavor it as him tapping into his vampiric side, and of course if you go Ascended Astarion later on, he will get even more of that, and so that I think is a great flavor win for this character as well, as Astarion sort of embraces his role as a vampiric archer, channeling his vampiric powers. If you're doing this for a main character or a custom character, the best races are honestly just the usual ones. Wood Elf for the additional movement speed is incredibly powerful because, of course, for archer builds, additional movement speed is great. This build also will almost never miss its attacks except on a natural 1, and so Halfling to reroll those natural 1s is incredibly strong, and Dwergar to start every fight invisible is good for stealth archers for obvious reasons. Being invisible makes you much stealthier and lets you also begin the fight from basically anywhere you want to begin it from, which of course is a huge advantage when positioning matters so much for archer builds. To begin with, when building this character, we need to fix these ability scores, so let's get right in and do that. And of course we are beginning with Ranger because that's going to give us the fastest access to the class features we need the most. We will take 17 Dexterity, 15 Constitution, or 16 Constitution, excuse me, and 15 Wisdom because we don't need any of the other stats. One of the advantages to playing an archer or dexterity-based character is you only need 3 of the stats, dex, con, and wisdom, because all 3 of those are the important saving throws in the game, and you really only need dexterity and constitution, though as a ranger we benefit some from having wisdom as well, so we get to put all of our points into single stats. This build, like a lot of archer builds, will also benefit pretty strongly from the gloves of dexterity. If you are intending to use those, you can reduce your dexterity to 8 and put those stats elsewhere, maybe take a little bit of extra charisma. You could also take, if you really want to use this for a conversation skills character, you could just take a more normal stat split and go up to 12 charisma to add in some conversation skills, or some extra strength if you prefer the jump distance and carry weight, but this is the sort of most optimal stat spread for the build. For our skills, the only important one is that we have stealth, and of course, since this is going to be a dexterity build, you might as well grab sleight of hand proficiency. Stealth proficiency is, of course, extremely important for a stealth archer build, because it's going to allow you to hide in more dangerous locations, and if you benefit from greater invisibility from an ally, then you can make those checks more often. Astarion's starting stats are also pretty good here because you just get perception, which is great. Starting as a ranger, allowing you to get perception is nice. Having perception on your stealth character and your trap disarming character, which this will be, is very good because it lets that character both spot traps and then disarm them. So all of those together is great. Those are the only important stats. The rest are skills. The rest are kind of up to you. Here, I'd probably just put this last point into athletics, just for fun and because survival is useless, but otherwise it doesn't really matter. For our favored enemy, we are going to go with Bounty Hunter, and the reason for this is that this will allow you to give enemies disadvantage on Ensnaring Strike. Even though we only have 15 Wisdom to start, and we'll get up to 16 Wisdom later on, and so the save DC on our Ensnaring Strike will not be very high, enemies who are saving against it with disadvantage are still very likely to fail, and Ensnaring Strike is an extremely powerful effect, so this is often a great thing to spend your spell slots on early, and giving enemies disadvantage on it is really strong, especially because it traps them in place, allowing you to hit them with more and more arrow attacks. It also helps that none of these others are any good, so we can just take Bounty Hunter without missing out on anything. For our Natural Explorer pick, either Beast Tamer, if you want the familiar, or Wasteland Wanderer Fire are good. Fire is the most common damage type, so it's typically the Wasteland Wanderer pick that you want. I'm going to suggest Wasteland Wanderer for Fire just by default, but the familiar is also very useful. If you do take the familiar, take the Raven. Blinding enemies can give you advantage on them, allowing us to more reliably hit and trigger sneak attacks. That's our level 1 build. Let's level up the character. And we're just going to continue taking levels in Ranger. As an archery character, of course, our fighting style that we're going to pick is going to be archery. And for our spell selection, well, we took Bounty Hunter for a reason, so we're going to take Ensnaring Strike. Ensnare is an extremely powerful condition. It prevents enemies from moving entirely, gives you advantage, and they take damage over time. The damage over time isn't that relevant, but a lot of people will say, this conflicts with your Hunter's Mark, and that is true, but if they're taking 1d6 piercing damage per turn, that's the same damage they would be taking from one attack with Hunter's Mark per turn. And so the concentration loss of, if you can reliably land Ensnaring Strike, then it's not that bad that it conflicts with Hunter's Mark. We will still take Hunter's Mark because sometimes you don't want to, even the chance of them getting out of the snare, but if you really feel like you're only going to use one of these 2 concentration spells, you could of course take something else. Speak with Animals is very nice just to have in your party. Goodberry gives you all sorts of different options for healing, and of course Enhanced Leap and Long Strider are incredible. Long Strider for additional movement speed for your whole party. Every party should have access to this somewhere in the build, and we'll get this next level if we don't get it this level. And Enhanced Leap gives us a ton of mobility in combat, which is very helpful. You can use this alongside a bonus action jump to stay permanently out of range of melee enemies, so all of those spells are very good for us. At Ranger level 3, we get to take our subclass, and even though we are intending to base this around sustained damage rather than initial burst damage, we're still going to take Gloomstalker as our subclass. Dread Ambusher gives you additional movement speed, +3 initiative, which is an insanely high bonus, and in the first round of combat, you can make an attack that deals an additional 1d8 damage. This is one of the worst written tooltips in the game. I had been hoping they would fix it in patch 6, but they didn't, because what it doesn't tell you about Dread Ambusher is that this attack is an extra attack that doesn't take an action. So we get a whole extra attack in the opening round of combat. Very few characters in the game get to make 2 attacks at level 3. Gloomstalker, Berserker Barbarian, Monk. There's only a few that get multiple attacks at starting at level 3, and that allows us to double our damage in the opening round of combat, which is incredible, and most combats won't go much longer than like 3 rounds, so this is basically plus 33% damage to your character for your typical combat. That's an enormous buff to your character, so think of it that way and you understand why this class feature is so good. We also get Superior Dark Vision, which is not super relevant, but does come up occasionally, and Bonus Action Hide, which is incredible for an archer, allowing us to fire an attack and then re-hide to gain advantage on our next attack. We also get Umbral Shroud, which lets you become invisible, so even if you aren't a Dwergar, you can start a lot of combats by turning invisible, moving to the optimal location, and then beginning the combat from there. For our spell selection here, we're going to take Enhanced Leap or Long Strider. If you have Long Strider elsewhere in the party, take Enhanced Leap. If you don't, then definitely take Long Strider. And then we are ready to go on to the next level. At Ranger level 4, we get to take a feat, and the first feat that we are going to take is Sharpshooter. A lot of people will say that you shouldn't take Sharpshooter early because your hit chance won't be good enough to use it, and I am here to tell you that that is, mathematically speaking, not correct. Sharpshooter will be higher average damage, up to the point where will be higher average damage on almost every attack unless you need an extremely high hit chance. So against an enemy with, like, at this level, something like 20 or 22 AC, you would be better off with an ASI compared to Sharpshooter. Otherwise, Sharpshooter will always be more average damage against those enemies. A good rule of thumb is turn off Sharpshooter if your attack has a 25% chance to hit or less, but that is going to be extremely rare because we've mitigated the Sharpshooter penalty, the -5 attack penalty, with or the archery fighting style, and we're going to have advantage on just about every attack that we're making because we're easily able to jump back into hiding using our bonus action hides. So you're going to hit with your Sharpshooter attacks extremely reliably with this character and do way more average damage. And average damage per attack also isn't the only thing you have to consider, because average damage is it's really a stand-in for average number of actions taken to kill an enemy. Sharpshooter, by increasing the maximum damage that you can do with a single attack, makes the average number of actions you take to kill a specific enemy even more increases it even more than the average damage, which it already increases significantly. So Sharpshooter is really good. You should use it regularly. And, of course, it also gives you the ability to shoot up from low ground, though you shouldn't typically start fights on low ground because you have such easy positioning with your invisibility and stealth. At Ranger level 5, we get extra attack. And we also get Misty Step, which is incredible, one of the best reasons to go Gloomstalker as well. Getting access to Misty Step is obviously awesome. Every single character should have this, and a positioning-based character like this benefits extremely strongly from it as well. This lets you get up onto high ground to make your arrow attacks very easily, or get away from enemies who've gotten too close. Extra attack, of course, just doubles our damage output, which is, needless to say, an enormous boost to your damage. And for our spell selection here, we're going to take Spike Growth. Spike Growth is a great thing to concentrate on. It wins a lot of encounters entirely by itself, by trapping enemies, and enemies will have to move towards you over it, so you can use it to gain lots of distance from melee enemies. This is an incredibly powerful effect that will be very useful to have access to throughout your adventuring career. Yes, one thing that you might be wondering is why do we have so many concentration spells? That's because typically we just want to cast whatever the best concentration spell for that fight is, and then just concentrate on it, rather than spending our actions on spells. Our actions are going to be used for weapon attacks, not spells, so it's better for us to just have a really strong concentration spell, use whichever the best one for the fight is, and then win the fight as a result of our weapon attacks. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, this is just kind of a standard Gloomstalker Ranger build, where's the spice? So let's add in some spice. We are going to take a multi-class, now that we've gotten our feat and our extra attack feature, which are what we really wanted out of Ranger, and we're going to multi-class into a somewhat unusual combination, Druid. This gives us access to a bunch of great Druid cantrips, most notably in this case resistance or guidance and resistance, both of which are excellent and will give you a lot of better options for skill checks and in dialogue. Being able to guidance yourself is going to help you with your ability to disarm traps. Also note that you can cast guidance before hiding, and then you get the guidance bonus on your stealth checks, which is very useful. And then you just break concentration on the guidance with whatever concentration spell you want for the fight. And we also get a bunch of additional spells here, so we can fill out our spell list with whatever we didn't take before. We're also wisdom-based on our druid spells, so while our save DC isn't incredible on these spells, it's still very useful. We're going to take whichever of Enhanced Leap or Long Strider we didn't take earlier. Definitely grab Healing Word, which gives you a defensive option and gives this character a little bit of extra utility. And then a couple other options here are you could take Ice Knife just to create ice surfaces. Always a great option, very powerful to be able to create ice surfaces. Create Water is also just a very good spell that you should have somewhere in your party. So if you don't have access to it elsewhere, this character can pick it up. And Fog Cloud you can also grab to cast and then hide in. If you use a bonus action to hide in Fog Cloud, because it provides heavy obscurement, enemies won't be able to see you, and it guarantees you an area to hide in. You can then step out of it, fire an arrow, and then step back into it and hide, making yourself effectively immune to ranged attacks. As long as you spend a bonus action hiding every turn, you've effectively got a pseudo-darkness with Fog Cloud. And of course you can also cast it on enemies to blind them, gaining advantage on attacks against them. Enemies who are held in place will not be able to get out of it, so this is very powerful as well. But the real reason that we're here is for Druid level 2, where we can take the Circle of the Spores Druid, giving us access to a bunch of wild shape forms, which also aren't irrelevant. I'll talk about that in a second. But more importantly, Symbiotic Entity. Symbiotic Entity gives us 8 temp hit points, and you deal an additional 1d6 necrotic damage with every single attack while you have them. It's very easy for this character to preserve these temporary hit points because you're a ranged stealth archer, so you basically won't be taking attacks from enemies. And having an additional d6 necrotic damage on every single attack when we're making so many attacks is a lot of extra damage, especially because all of our attacks are made with advantage and we'll be using critical hit gear and later on guaranteeing that we're getting critical hits. These extra d6s will also be doubled very frequently, which will add a lot of sustained damage to this character. You also get Halo of Spores as a reaction, which, since this character doesn't have a lot of uses for its reaction, this is actually like a not irrelevant way to add just a tiny bit of extra damage to your character. You also get the really cool trick that somebody pointed out in the comments of a previous Spore Druid video of mine, so shout out to you. Sorry, I'm blanking on who it was, but this was just a cool trick where you can drop a healing potion at your feet, or other potion at your feet, as a free action, then use your reaction Halo of Spores to break that potion and get a heal that uses your reaction, or a buff potion that uses your reaction, without having to waste your bonus action drinking the potion. Just a really cool little effect that you can have to drink a potion of speed or a healing potion in the middle of combat without having to spend an action on it. For our additional prepared spells, we're just going to stick with all the ones that we wanted from earlier that are just the powerful spells that we have, and so we've now added a bunch of extra damage to every single attack. But let's of course not stop here and see if we can continue to increase our damage. We are going to, at this next character level, dip into a third class and take a level of Rogue. Rogue gives us sneak attack. I mean, we're hiding every single combat, so we should be able to trigger the sneak attack damage every turn. This is just an extra d6 of damage every turn. And it also gives us a bunch of extra skill expertise, so we can now have expertise in sleight of hand and stealth and be extremely good at both of these things. If you really want those earlier, you could move the rogue level earlier in the build. You could even take it at level 1 if you want to have sleight of hand and stealth expertise earlier on in the build, but this is just a great way to add some additional proficiencies to your party and make sure that you are always passing your stealth checks. This character is also one of the best possible characters to cast greater invisibility on because our stealth checks will be so good. At rogue level 2, we get cunning action, hide, dash, and disengage. Now, cunning action, hide we already have effectively from our Gloomstalker levels, but the cunning action, dash, and disengage are still very good to have on archers. Just gives you a lot of extra mobility throughout the game. And at don't want to add a class at the next character level. Just a little misclick there, my apologies. And at rogue level 3, we are going to dip into assassin rogue. This means that when we start combat, every single attack that we make is going to have advantage, which is going to make our sharpshooter attacks much more likely to hit and trigger our additional sneak attack damage, and we get guaranteed critical hits against surprised enemies. Since this character has the Gloomstalker invisibility, super high hide checks, and is an archer, we should be able to start every single fight by surprising enemies, meaning that you will get 2 full rounds of attacks against them while they're surprised, and you'll almost always win initiative thanks to being a dexterity-based character with the Gloomstalker initiative bonus, so you're going to have several turns of attacks with advantage and guaranteed critical hits. Those guaranteed critical hits multiply our sneak attack damage and multiply the additional damage from our Circle of the Spores Druids, meaning that you are going to gain an enormous amount of burst. This is less burst damage than the fighter version of this build that uses Assassin, Rogue, Gloomstalker, Ranger, and 2 levels of fighter, because you don't get action surge. But the burst damage is pretty comparable to that version of the build. It's only a little bit less, and we get much more sustained damage throughout the rest of the fight thanks to the additional Druid damage dice. Finally, at character level 4, at rogue level 4, excuse me, we get to add an additional feat. We get to take our ability improvement and even out our ability scores, going up to 16 wisdom and 18 dexterity. Of course, you don't have to have carried these odd numbers throughout the whole game. You can start with different numbers and then respec to this once you actually reach the ability score improvement, but this will let you get to 18 dex and 16 wisdom. 18 dex is enough on this build, although, like I said, you can, if you want to use the Gloves of Dexterity, dump this and put these points elsewhere, get higher Charisma or something like that, which would definitely be an option as well. Finally, at character level 12, we could take an additional level of Rogue for Uncanny Dodge, which makes this character a little more defensive and a little extra sneak attack, but I think there's an even better option because each of our attacks, every single attack we make, represents so much damage. We'd rather just get more attacks. So let's go ahead and take a level of Cleric, take War Domain Cleric, which also gets us heavy armor proficiency if we want to wear Grimm's Helmet or something like that. And War Domain Cleric will 3 times per day give us an extra additional attack as a bonus action. This is going to let us massively increase our damage even further. So our opening rounds of combat, we're going to get our initial attack before combat starts, then our action will get refreshed by being an Assassin Rogue, and then we get 2 attacks with our main action, 1 from our Gloomstalker Ranger attack, and 1 from our Cleric attack, for 5 attacks in our opening round of combat. That's only 1 fewer than the fighter version of this build would get, and each of those attacks is dealing an extra d6, so the damage is very comparable to a fighter version of the Archer build, and then continues to be high throughout the rest of the encounter. For our spells here, we already have the best Druid cantrips, so we can take something like Blade Ward, just as an additional panic button, and then Light or something like that. The cantrip selections really don't matter at this point, but we do get to prepare a couple spells. You can have Bless, which is still good even at this point in the game, but for the most part, you are not going to use your cleric spells that much, but having access to Sanctuary is just really good. Great panic button to have at the end of the game. Create or Destroy Water is still relevant at this point, and Bless is still good to cast on allies, though this character will have other uses for its concentration. Protection from evil and good can be some advantage. The spell selection here is not particularly relevant, but grabbing Sanctuary with a 1-level dip into this character is really good, and we just are here for the extra attacks primarily more than the spells. One thing that's also really nice about this build is because we took just a bunch of wisdom-based characters, we still use wisdom for any spells we cast from items or scrolls, so we will be able to use our much higher wisdom save DC in order to use our illithid powers if we have those, or items and scrolls, and etc. This character with only 16 wisdom isn't going to have amazing DCs on those, but it is very relevant that we've kept our wisdom. Overall, this character is going to do just massive ranged damage and be a huge threat. It has incredible mobility thanks to Misty Step and Hide and Invisibility, so you can always start combat from where you want to start it, and the amount of damage that you output is simply absurd. For items, the name of the game is just increasing our damage. We're looking for anything that has additional damage dice added to our weapon attacks, like the Flawed Helldusk Gloves, and then the best bow that you have access to at any point in the game. I personally am actually quite partial to the Deadshot because its keen attack makes you more likely to hit, and I really like reliability in my weapons, but so this makes you just more likely to land your attacks. The highest damage setup for your bow is going to be to use the Titan String bow here that adds additional damage equal to your strength modifier, and then drink an Elixir of Cloud Giant Strength or Hill Giant Strength earlier in the game. This is available from Act 1 and gives you is going to be the highest damage output possible throughout the entire game, so that's just a great setup to have. The Gloves of Dexterity can replace taking Dexterity, though I like just building Dexterity and then having gloves that add damage, and then any items that you can get that increase your critical hit chance, like the Shade Slayer Cloak, like the Covert Cowl, or others in those vein, make you more likely to critically hit. The number of damage dice that we do per attack is very high, so critical hits doubling our damage dice is going to be a massive increase to our damage output. Also, as always, remember with archer builds that you can have melee weapons equipped and benefit from any passive effects that you have. For example, the Knife of the Undermountain King decreases the chance that you need, decreases the roll you need to critically hit, and also allows you to re-roll any damage dice that roll 2 or less, massively increasing your damage. So just having this equipped, not even if you're using it, is really good. You can also benefit from the AC bonus of a shield, even while you have a ranged weapon equipped. So you can always have a shield equipped and have great AC. And in fact, this build can be one of the highest AC builds in the game possible if you equip one of the medium armors with uncapped dexterity. So you can benefit from something like the Armor of Agility, which allows you to add your full dex modifier to your armor class and have some of the highest possible AC in the game, thanks to benefiting from a shield and your full dexterity and medium armor, while always using a ranged weapon. So those options are all very good in terms of itemization. For jewelry, you're just looking for anything that either gives you defensive utility that you might need in a panic, or gives you additional damage. Anything that increases your spell DC can also make your ensnaring strikes more likely to land. That's not a huge bonus, but if you don't need those for another party member, you can benefit from that. And then anything that increases your initiative is, of course, incredibly good. Winning initiative is very important to this character, although you're very good at it, thanks to being a Gloomstalker with 18 dexterity. But winning initiative is super important to this character, so items like even the Elegant Studded Leather that gives you initiative bonus is very good as well. This also gives you, with shield, a great defensive option, so it's just a great item even on into the late game. Those initiative bonuses will be very powerful. This character is pretty item independent, though. All you really need is a good bow, and you'll be doing great. And of course, Like all archers, this character benefits very heavily from using the special arrows that you can find throughout the game. All of these are incredible, and you should use the appropriate ones for different situations, being able to light things on fire, freeze them, attack multiple targets, and so on, create darkness, or silence enemies. All of those are incredibly powerful effects. And this character also does really well thanks to your very reliable hit chance and numerous weapon attacks with poisons and weapon coatings, so definitely keep an eye out. You're one of the best characters to use those. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the sustained damage archer, and of course, as always, if you have, feel free to leave a comment, like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm, so I really appreciate people taking the time to do it. And you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 builds and other strategy game videos. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.